The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone, this is Elizabeth. So sorry, I hear that we're having some technical difficulties. So I'm just going to go ahead and restart from the beginning so that way you'll be able to kind of hear everything that I had to say. So let me... So as I previously mentioned, this is a housing inventory count training for my Rapid Rehousing, SSVF, and GPD TIP programs. So if you have one of those programs, you are at the right place. So I do hear that everyone's able to hear me, so that's great. So again, I'll just restart. So just to quickly go over some housekeeping rules, just remember that all your lines have been muted during this presentation. If you do have a question, please utilize the chat box located to the right-hand side of your screen. Just go ahead and type that in, and if I have some time, I'll go ahead and say your question. If at the end of the presentation we do have a couple of minutes to spare, I will open up the lines for some questions. As you can see with the technical difficulties I had this a little bit ago, make sure that your computer is connected with the mic and that it is working if you want to ask your question. You'll have to raise your hand and then I will unmute you so you can ask your question. If you do not have a working mic or if you're not sure, you can always use a phone and call-in option to go ahead and connect via phone and then ask your question that way. All right, so for our HIC presentation today, we have two main objectives. One is understanding the housing inventory count process and purpose, and two, being able to complete a HIC survey for each of your Rapid Rehousing, SSVF, and GPD programs at your agency. So on your screen, you'll see our agenda for this presentation. We'll be going briefly over some common terms, along with the HIC history, purpose, and process. We will then dive into the HIC survey sections, and I'll be mentioning how your program will have to complete the HIC survey differently than your other maybe transitional housing, permanent supportive housing, or emergency shelter programs. I'll also show some common mistakes that I saw in 2016, so hopefully you'll be able to catch those before you go ahead and hit submit. I'll also be talking about the due date, and then finally some helpful tips and resources. All right, so some common terms and acronyms. So the housing inventory count, we usually shorten it to the HIC. So if you see anything throughout this presentation, and sometimes I do interchange both the HIC and housing inventory count, so just know that I am using that is the same thing. The point in time count is shortened as the PIT, which is a separate process that happens at the same time of the housing inventory count. Later on in this presentation, I will be talking about the beds and units and how they're different. HUD is short for the U.S. Department of Housing Urban Development. That is one of our major funders here in the city of Chicago, so I'll be talking about them briefly as well. HUD also has the Homeless Data Exchange, which is shortened by HDX. That is our online system that we use to report our HIC and PIT information to HUD. The Chicago Program Models Chart is shortened by PMC. So whenever you see that acronym, that is what I'm talking about. And finally, the Continuum of Care, the COC, that is composed of stakeholders that are invested in ending homelessness in the city of Chicago. And it is composed of service providers, funders, government, individuals of lived experience, etc. So what is the housing inventory count? So the housing inventory count is just a snapshot of what our housing stock is in the city of Chicago at the same point in time as our point in time count. So they usually happen in the last 10 days in January, and the HIC is conducted every year. The reason why we do it is because HUD requires us to do it, but it also contributes to our annual homeless assessment report. For those of you that are not familiar with the AHART is, it's a report that goes to Congress that shows a snapshot of individuals experiencing homelessness along with our housing inventory count. So they really utilize this information to see and make nationwide decisions on funding for homelessness. The HIC also contributes to the COC application. So for those of you that are familiar with the NOFA for the COC funded programs, you're very well aware that the COC NOFA is composed of two sections. One is the individual project applications, and the second is the COC application that speaks to our progress that Chicago is making in ending homelessness in the city of Chicago, how we're hitting those system benchmarks, and our plans for the future. And finally, the HIC informs our local funding decisions. So not only is it informing our nationwide funding decisions at the Congress level, but locally we also determine if there's any gaps in our system that we need to evaluate. So we'll take a look at what our point in time count information and look also at our stock and seeing if there's a gap in there that we need to fill. So on your screen, you'll see the 2017 process. So it's composed of 4 steps. The first one, which you are here today, is the HIC trainings. That will be followed up by the HIC submissions. All the HIC submissions are due no later than January 30th. So that's this next Monday. And then between February to March, I use that time to follow up with agencies. So if there's any discrepancies in the HIC submissions, I usually follow up with an email or a phone call to get some clarifying information. And finally, around April is when HUD will release their due date and open up HDX for us to go ahead and submit our HIC and PID information. So as I mentioned earlier, our HIC and PID are two different processes, but they're intertwined. So we do have to cross-reference one another to ensure that we're submitting accurate data to HUD. So who needs to submit a HIC? So first of all is for our rapid rehousing programs. So all our rapid rehousing programs that have beds and units dedicated to serving homelessness, individuals experiencing homelessness, and this includes families as well. One, they have to be actively enrolled in your program on the night of the count. This year, the night of the count will happen on January 26th, which is this Thursday. So make sure that you note who is enrolled in your program this Thursday. And 2 is that they are no longer homeless and they're in a permanent housing on January 26th. So that means if they're in an actual unit on the night of the 26th, and that may be in that phase of locating housing, okay? Because if they are in that phase that they are locating housing, they will be counted through another provider. So just make sure that you are aware of that. For my SSVF program, so same thing, you have beds and units dedicated to individuals and families experiencing homelessness that, 1, are actively enrolled in your SSVF program on the night of the count. Again, the night of the count is January 26th. 2, they are no longer homeless and they're in a permanent housing placement on the night of the count. And 3, they are not receiving SSVF only prevention programs, services. So make sure, I know a couple of my SSVF programs have just clients that receive the SSVF homeless prevention services, so those individuals will not be counted on your HIC. For my GPD TIP program, so again, these are beds and units dedicated to individuals and families experiencing homelessness that are enrolled in a GPD TIP program and that are no longer homeless on the night of the count. Currently, we do have a couple of GPD TIP programs that currently are being classified as transitional housing. So we're awaiting confirmation from the VA liaison to determine which HUD classification. Okay, so once I receive that HUD clarification, I will reach out to you individually to let you know what individuals to count for the purpose of the HIC. So how many and when are they due? So as I mentioned, the point in time count is January 26th. You will have to complete a separate HIC survey for each of your applicable programs. So we have a couple of agencies that have different programs at their agencies. You might have an emergency shelter, a rapid rehousing, and an SSVF. In that case, you'll have to submit 3 separate HIC surveys. As a rule of thumb, if you are participating in the HMIS system, you will have to kind of see if you use 2 or 3 different HMIS ID numbers. That's a pretty good indication on the number of HIC surveys that you have to complete. So let's say you use 2 different HMIS ID numbers, you'll have to submit 2 HICs. Okay, so that's a nice rule of thumb there. Each HIC survey must be submitted no later than 5 p.m. on Monday, January 30th. So you can start looking at, what your numbers are on the night of January 26th, but you can still have some time to check in with your coworker, verify those numbers, and you can go ahead and submit on Friday, or you still have until Monday till 5 p.m. On your screen, you'll see the sections for the 2017 HIC. There are 10 sections. It may look a little bit long, but the nice thing is for those of you that have participated in the HIC last year, it looks very similar to last year. So a lot of information will pre-populate, so you'll just be asked to confirm or update the information. So you'll be asked about your project information. This is your agency number, some contact information. Your project type, your target population, your HIC beds, your new and under development beds, your bed occupancy, your HMIS participation, your specialized beds, your HIC units, and your HIC occupancy. So just to get a quick glance, I'm going to launch a poll. So it should become visible on your screen. And I just kind of want to know how many of you out there have completed the HIC in previous years. Great. So it looks like I have, so I'm having a little bit of switch. So I have a large portion of you that have done this previously, and about 25% it's your first time. So thank you for that. That's good to know kind of what my audience looks like. All right. So for your project information, again, you'll state your agency name and the primary contact. So that might be you, or it could be someone else at your agency. Then we do have a space for secondary contact. We do encourage that a separate person be listed here. That way we ensure that not only one person at your agency is receiving the email's communication. We'll ask you about your site address, which I'll go in over in a little bit of, and also about your funding sources. One thing to note about the primary contact, make sure if you are the one that's completing the HIC and you list someone separately, they will receive the HIC confirmation email at the end. So just make sure that you are aware of that, and if you do list someone different than you, make sure that you touch base with them to ensure that they did receive the HIC confirmation email. So for your address, so the majority of my programs on the line, you'll probably be a tenant-based scattered site. So for those, I will ask you to enter an address where the majority of beds and units are located. You will also see, once you click on that option, is you'll indicate what zip codes your other beds are located. So you'll kind of have a list of zip codes, so just make sure that you are clicking. This is for our internal reference as well, to know kind of where all our scattered sites are in the city of Chicago. If you do happen to just have a site project address, you'd go ahead and list the address. And if you have a site-based multiple address, I know this is a lot for our programs that maybe have two or three buildings to one location. So it would be the same as a tenant base. You'd ask where the majority of beds are located. And finally, if any of you are domestic violence, you would not be asked for an address because your address is confidential. So the next part is you'll have to ask about your funding sources. So whether you're receiving ESG, COC, or VA, or the HUD-VASH is more applicable to you. So for my SSVF programs and GPD, you will have to check off the VA to get some additional questions pop up. And if you're my rapid rehousing, the majority of you receive ESG, but there are a couple of you that receive the COC funding. So just make sure that you check the appropriate funding source. If you are unsure about the funding source for your program, feel free to check in with your finance department just to make sure that you're indicating the correct funding source. So here on your screen, you'll see a snapshot of what the survey looks like. So ESG or COC is funded through the HUD-McKinney-Vento. So you'll have to indicate which one of those programming it is. So if you receive DFSS funding for ESG, you would have to indicate the HUD ESG Rapid Rehousing. If you do receive rapid rehousing funding through the COC, and that's through the NOFA application, you'd indicate the COC rapid rehousing. For my SSVF and GPD programs, you'll be asked a similar question. So you'll first see the HUD-McKinney-Vento. So if you do not receive any funding source through that, you will click NA. Then the next series of questions will ask you if you receive any of the following: the Health and Human Service Runaway Homeless Youth, HOPWA, the HUD Veteran Affairs Supportive Housing. But most of our SSVF and GPD comes through the VA. So you would go ahead and click on that option. And then you'll get an additional question that pops up. So you'll have to indicate whether you receive SSVF funding or GPD TIP funding. So be sure to go ahead and click on the appropriate funding source for your program. Again, if you're unsure, make sure you check in with someone at your agency just to make sure that we're categorizing your funding source accurately. Similar to last year, the survey is set up that it will have pre-populated information from 2016. So you will be asked to use a username and a password. Similar to last year, your username is going to be the project name, and the password will be your HMIS ID number. Now I know you may not have that information available in front of you, so that's why the survey has included a hyperlink that says the 2016 HIC submission chart. Once you click on that, you'll see this window pop up. So similar to last year, we'll list all the project names in a blue, and then all the passwords in an orange kind of color. So, for example, if I was a little bit of heaven, ESR, and overnight program, what a nice rule that I've done is just kind of left click, I highlight that cell and I left click it, and then I copy and paste that into my username box of the survey. And then I just go ahead and type in the password. The reason I do this is, one, it's time saver because it eliminates the need for me to go ahead and type everything in. But also, as you can see, there are a couple of names that have a dash in between. And since the survey is set up, it's a rather case-sensitive login. If you do not type it in exactly as it is, it won't allow you to proceed. So usually what I've just done is copy and paste. For my new program, so I know if you did not participate in the HIC last year, we won't have any of your HIC information from 2016, and we don't have your HMIS ID number or username. So what we have to do is enter you as a new program. So if after looking at the 2016 HIC submission chart, you do not see your program anywhere on there, go ahead and utilize the new program. So you'd have to go ahead depending, so for my SSVF and my rapid rehousing programs, you'll go ahead and click new RRH program. And then your password would be that 2004. Okay, and on the back end, I will be updating that information just to make sure that for next year, we'll have your information available. That leads you into the second section, your project type. So you'll be asked to confirm whether your Chicago program model, HUD type, and bed type is accurate. Since none of you are an emergency shelter, for your bed type, it will say NA. So you'll be asked to confirm this information, and if you need to do some updates, some additional questions will show. So this is a snapshot of how it will show on your screen. So one thing to note is that because we've made the text boxes a little bit larger this year so that way you're able to see the entire phrase that's in there, you'll see that there's this little gray bar there. So it's a little bit tiny on your screen once you get to the survey. So if you do see that in any of the questions, just make sure that you click on that and scroll over to the right to see the entire content. Okay, so similar like this, you'll be able to see the bed types. Okay. So if you're asking yourself kind of what is a rapid rehousing program, maybe you're new and you kind of want to know what those expectations are, we do have the Chicago program models chart. It was revised in December of 2014. So you'll be able to click on that and there is an option for a rapid rehousing. So if you're not familiar with that, I do encourage you to take a look at it just to see what those outcomes are. I know the COC is currently looking at updating the Chicago program models chart, so we will probably have a revised vision by this time next year. If you're asking yourself what is a transitional housing or what is a permanent housing rapid rehousing program, you'll be able to see the definitions. There is a HICS survey PDF version on our website currently, so that will give you a list of all the questions I can possibly ask in the HICS survey. Now, since the survey is set up that you will only have to answer certain questions and you'll only be asked additional questions if you need to update, all those questions will not be visible as you're going through the HICS survey. But if you want to see kind of all the questions, you can feel free to review the PDF prior to the release of the link for the HICS survey. Section 3 is regarding your target population. So one thing to note that your 2016 target population will pre-populate. For a lot of your programs, a target population is not mandatory. So I know since I've been doing the HIC for a couple of years now, I'm able to identify some agencies that switch target population from year to year. So in many of those cases, I reach out to those programs and ask because I'll see that in 2014, they said they were serving single males, and then 2015, it was single females, and then 2016 is households with children. So when situations like that arise, I reach out to those agencies and I ask if they've been switching their target population from year to year. In which most cases they're not. In most cases, individuals say that they took a look at what the current clientele's kind of demographic was and then select that. It's not really what we're asking here at the target population. We're asking for those target populations that you're really focusing your attention on serving. So whether that is maybe you're only accepting single individuals or single males, or maybe your program is only for families. So that's the target population that I'm referring to. Okay, if you don't have one, if you serve families, singles, whoever qualifies for your program, then you would click NA. So if the information on the 2016 target population is incorrect, you'll go ahead and say no and additional questions will show up. If it is accurate, you'll be able to skip to the next question. The next section is the HIC beds. So again, your 2016 HIC total occupied beds will show. So a thing to note for rapid rehousing, SSVF, and GPD TIP programs, you'll be only seeing the number of total beds that were occupied in 2016, which may be different than your total number of beds that you have overall to serve. And that's okay. For the purpose of the HIC, you will only report on those total number of occupied beds. So again, similar to how we mentioned, you would only indicate those clients that have been placed into permanent housing at the night of the count and that are not awaiting placement. It'll also show the bed and unit availability and overflow beds. Now, since you are not an emergency shelter, you'll see an NA for that. So, since your total occupied beds will be different this year than last year, you'll have to say no, those numbers are not accurate, and you'll go ahead and update that, okay? So just make sure that this is the difference in completing the HIC for any other program. For your type of program, you would have to indicate just the number of occupied beds, and that would be kind of your universe number moving forward for the purpose of the HIC. So again, this is kind of a screenshot of what it'll show. It'll show your total number of beds. So this is going to be your total number of occupied beds in 2017 for the night of the count on January 26th. For your program, you will not have to indicate any new or under development beds. Okay, so even if you did receive additional funding to expand your program, for the purpose of the HIC, you will not be reporting on those. So just make sure when you get to Section 5, you say no. You do not have any new or under development beds coming online. Section 6 is about your bed occupancy. So you'll be asked, out of that total number of occupied beds, how many of those were indicated by the different household types. So your household without children are your single individuals. Your household with at least one adult and one child, that means that you have one adult and one child under the age of 18. And households with only children. That is for your children, unaccompanied children under the age of 18. So this is not a section for when you're going to kind of separate the children from the parents. No, this is only for your unaccompanied children under the age of 18. And then finally, you're going to add the total sum. For your program, you will not indicate any vacant or unoccupied beds. So this total sum under the occupied beds, that should equal your total number of beds in the previous sections. If you have any cribs, go ahead and complete that. So that would be any infant in a crib on the night of the count. You'll be asked whether your program was at full capacity, and for the purpose of the HIC, you will say that you are at full capacity. The reason is because we know that you have a couple of other clients that might be awaiting placement, so you're doing the housing location, and that has, you just haven't given your client the unit. Maybe you're in the process, or maybe they're still looking out for a unit that fits their needs. But for the purpose of the HIC, you're just going to indicate that you were at full capacity. Section 7 is about your HMIS participation. So in 2016, it'll show what you indicated if all your beds were participating, maybe you had a portion, or maybe your project did not participate. And if you are a DV project, you should not be participating in HMIS. So you'll be asked to confirm that information, and if you need to update, some additional questions will show. If not, you'll be able to proceed to the next section. So, Section 8 is regarding your specialized beds. Again, in 2016, that pre-populated information will show. So if you have any dedicated beds for chronic homeless, veterans, or youth beds, that will be the place where you'll show. So you will have to indicate whether those beds, the number of beds that are dedicated for that, and if those numbers are accurate, you'll just say yes, and you'll be able to move on to the next section. For specialized/dedicated beds, so I'm really looking that your program is currently documenting for chronic homeless or veteran status. So for all my SSVF programs, you should indicate those veteran beds. And if you on my rapid rehousing programs, if you have chronic homeless dedicated beds, you would have to indicate those here. If you do have any of these specialized beds, you'll get a chart similar to the total beds kind of show up. So this is just going to be for my reference to see how many of those dedicated number of beds are dedicated for singles, families, or children under the age of 18. So you'll have to indicate which household type they fall under, and just make sure that your total number adds up to the total number of veteran or dedicated beds that you indicated. Section 9 is regarding your HIC unit. So again, 2016 information will pre-populate, so you will have to update this section because your 2016 unit number is what was occupied for units last year, which may be different come January 26th. And then you'll be asked to move on to the unit occupancy. So again, you'll have to base that only on the number of occupied units. So you'll have to indicate how many of those units were occupied by a single household, by a family household, and by only children, and these are unaccompanied children under the age of 18. And your total sum should match what you indicated as your total unit number. Similar to the bed occupancy, you'll be asked if you were at full capacity. For your program, you will have to indicate that you were at full capacity. So let's take a minute to talk about what the beds and units are and how they're different. So I think everyone's familiar with a bed and knows when I talk about a bed, I don't think I really have a lot of questions as to what I mean from a bed. So when I'm talking about a bed, it's really that piece of furniture that individuals are using for sleep. So it could be a cot, it could be a mattress, things of that nature. I think people tend to get a little bit more confused what I mean about a unit. So what I mean by a unit is anything that you would consider as a separate living quarter. So for my rapid rehousing and SSVF programs, it's pretty nice because you think of a separate living quarter as the apartment that you placed your client in. I think it gets a little bit more confusing for bigger programs such as like emergency shelters that may have just one large room where all their beds are placed. So it's really looking at where those number of beds that you indicated that people are sleeping in, where are those beds located. So if they're in just one apartment, you would just indicate one unit. And that's it. That's the HIC. So you will see the thank you page, and you'll receive a confirmation email that includes a PDF of your HIC submission. This is proof that you went ahead and submitted, so just make sure that you hold on to that. And again, just as a reminder, this email will go out to the primary contact that was listed in Section 1. So if that was maybe your CEO or your director, make sure to check in with them to ensure that they did receive that confirmation. Since this email goes out through our Survey Gizmo software, sometimes I do encourage individuals to check your junk folder because sometimes those emails tend to go through there. All right, so now that we've gone in and talked about the HIC survey, we're going to go through some common mistakes that I saw in 2016. So here I see a submission. They indicated that their total beds were 50, and they went ahead and completed the bed occupancy with 20 single beds occupied, 0 for families, 0 for unaccompanied children under the age of 18, which brings down their total occupied number as 20. And then they completed 2 unoccupied beds and 0 for cribs. So as you can see, this number equals 20. And it must be the total sum of 50. So if you really had 50 people in beds on the night of the count, this 20 should be a 50. But this kind of raises more of a question because since I'm not sure, maybe you only had 20 occupied people, so maybe your total beds is incorrect. So make sure that you're checking that as you're completing the HIC. Again, for your type of program, you will not have to indicate any unoccupied beds. So you're really just focusing on the number of occupied beds that you have on the night of the count. Now this is where it's slightly different for those other program models. If you have an emergency shelter, transitional housing, and a housing program, or a permanent supportive housing, you would have to complete that differently. But This is only for Rapid Rehousing, SSVF, and GPD TIP programs. All right. Now we have someone who will say, oh, you know what? So let's say I followed up with them and they'll let me know, yes, I actually forgot those 30 individuals that were in beds on the night of the count. So that means that I had 20 singles, 30 individuals in a family, 0 for unaccompanied children, which brings my total sum of 50. Then they see the next question. So for my programs that are participating in the DFSS point-in-time count, this is particular to them. But for all other programs, as you can see on your screen, this number has to match the number of occupied total beds in the previous question. So they went ahead and listed 25. So as you can see, this 50 does not match that 25. So just make sure that you remain consistent and ensure that the questions are being answered the same. Next, I have a program that indicated that they had 33 total occupied units. So they went ahead and completed the occupancy for units as 20 for single, 2 unoccupied, and then they just brought down the 20 and the 2. So as you can see, that total equals out to 22. And they left all these blank spaces. So, and they listed a 2 here. So again, make sure that your total occupied matches your total number of units, and you're not indicating any number of unoccupied units. For the blank spaces, make sure you're typing in a 0, even if it's not applicable. If you didn't have any families or any unaccompanied children, make sure you type in that 0. If not, you will receive an error message that will not allow you to move to the next section. All right. So here, I think one of the major things that I saw last year was the inconsistency with the funding sources and the dedicated beds. So as you can see here, I had a program that indicated they received SSVF funding. However, when they got to the dedicated / specialized beds, I saw that none of their beds were dedicated for veterans. So since I know the funding source is specifically for veteran families, I had to follow up with that program just to ensure that they indicated the correct funding, or they had to update that veteran number. So make sure that you're consistent. Next, I have a program. As you can see in 2016, it'll show up that it was a rapid rehousing program. And then for the bed occupancy, oops, sorry, that's skipped. So for all my rapid rehousing SSVF programs and GPD TIP programs, please make sure that you account for all children to 1 bed and not doubled up. I know we saw that a couple in the surveys last year. So this is really more for my transitional interim housing and emergency shelter programs, since we do have small children that are doubled up to a bed. For your program, the majority of your children are, 1 children to 1 bed. So just make sure that you account for that. Here is a common question that I received last year. So I did get a lot of questions that they called me in a panic that the page would not allow them to move forward, that they didn't know what they did. Maybe there was some problem with the software. So if you do receive this message at the top of your page, that means that you missed a question. I know sometimes it's easily overlooked. So just make sure that if you do receive that message that you are checking that page to make sure that there are no unanswered questions. If there is, you'll see the question that was overlooked is surrounded by a yellow orangey outline. So just make sure that you answer all the questions before hitting the next button. So again, you have to submit a HIC survey for each applicable program no later than 5 p.m. on Monday, January 30th. All the surveys will be submitted via Survey Gizmo. We will not be accepting PDFs. The Survey Gizmo link has not been sent out, and it will not be released until January 26th. The reason is because we do have a couple of programs that will try to submit early, like on January 25th. and then I'll have to toss them and ask them to resubmit. So I don't want anyone to do double work. So that's why we will not be releasing the HIC survey until January 26th. A couple of helpful hints. So, I do encourage you, especially if this is your first time, to review the HIC PDF version to see all the questions. So you have a chance to review them, and if you have any questions about what the question is getting at, you can feel free to contact me. I tend to like having all the HIC information prior to entering it into Survey Gizmo because this way I'll just enter it and be done with it. Make sure that your point-in-time count questions are answered correctly. So again, for your program, when I'm talking about the PIT questions, it's really looking at your occupied number. So just make sure that you're answering that question correctly. And this is regarding what the occupancy was on the night of the count of January 26th. I will have the survey set up where you'll be able to save and return at a later point, which I'll be going over briefly. And then finally, you can feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions about the HIC. So the save and return later option. So all the HIC surveys will have an opportunity to save and continue later if you desire to do so. So at the top of each page, you will see that grayish bar that says save and continue later. So it is rather small, I do encourage you to look at the top of your page before contacting us if you're not able to see it. One thing to note that you have to make sure once you click on that link, you'll get a window that pops up and looks like that. Make sure that your email address is correct. The link is unique and I cannot resend it. So, I know sometimes in another project we have this set up that individuals will complete it and indicate .com instead of .org, so they're not getting that unique link. So just make sure that you do receive that email before closing out the Survey Gizmo, because once that link is saved, I'm not able to resend it if it was sent to an incorrect address. Okay, so just make sure if you're using that option that you're typing in that email address correctly. So in the event that you're not the person who will complete the HIC, I will be posting this webinar along with the general HIC webinar on our All Chicago website. So people can feel free to review at a later time, or you can send the link to your coworker in the event that he or she has to complete the housing inventory count. So for my other program model, so if you have an emergency shelter, an interim housing program, transitional housing program, or so forth, we are doing some HMIS bed list training. So this is for programs that are participating in the PIT sheltered count via HMIS. And then we are also doing PIT and HIC in-person trainings. They started last week, but there's still time to register for the last one, which is scheduled for tomorrow. So if your program has to participate in the PIT sheltered count, please contact DFSS for that in-person training. All right, so we have some time for some questions. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to raise your hand, and that way I will open up the line and you'll be able to ask your question. For those of you that don't have that option, you can also feel free to type in your question into the chat box and I can read it out loud and answer it. All right, Sandra, I see you have your hand up, so I'm going to go ahead and unmute you so you can ask your question. Hello, Sandra? Okay, so your mic might not be working, so you can feel free to chat in, type that into the chat box. I'm just going to put your hand down if you have a question. If not, you can raise your hand again once you've connected with the phone. All right, so I'm just going to give a minute for anyone that has a question. All right. So for scattered sites, there's a question if they have to enter all the zip codes or a majority is okay. So you will have to indicate a majority address. So if you have one address where all those units are located, you'll go ahead and type in the actual physical address. And then you'll have to just check off zip codes. So where you have, your other units located, you'll be asked to check off those zip codes as well. So thank you, Sandra. All right, so I'm not getting any additional questions, but if you do happen to have a question after the presentation is over, you can always feel free to call me. I will say one thing about calling me is that, as you can see right now, I'm busy in the webinar, so I will not have access to my phone. However, email is the quickest way to get in contact with me. Since I am doing presentations all day tomorrow as well, I will not be by my phone, but you can always feel free to send me an email at the cocprograms@allchicago.org. That way I'll be able to respond to you quicker. If you do have some HMIS question-related questions, you'll see the HMIS Help Desk email address on your screen. And finally, for those programs that are participating in the PIT sheltered count, I know a lot of my agencies have multiple programs at your agency. So if you have not heard from DFSS regarding the point-in-time sheltered count, please contact Felicia Collins at cityofchicago.org. She'll be able to connect you with the trainings and get you the necessary information for January 26th. Okay. So that's it, everyone. Thank you for attending. And again, if you have any questions, by all means, you can feel free to contact me and ask your questions. So thank you very much for attending the 2017 Housing Inventory Count Training for the Rapid Rehousing, SSVF, and GPD TIP programs. Thank you.